All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today we're going to unpack the intense and honestly often incredibly rigid psychology of Italian sports media, and we're going to use historic and modern clashes with Celtic FC as a really fascinating lens to do it. You know, if you've ever followed European football or really any major international sport, you've probably noticed how completely different cultures react to winning, losing, and tactical innovation. Well, today we're zeroing in on Italy. It's a nation with a rich, complex, and sometimes highly toxic sports media ecosystem. We'll explore how a historic refusal to accept tactical disruption decades ago has actually echoed through time, completely shaping the way journalists treat today's athletes.
So here's our roadmap for today. Number 1. The 1967 Tactical Revolution. 2. The Denial of Lisbon. 3. Italy's toxic media culture. 4. Warriors, traitors, and sexism. And 5. Modern clashes, Celtic and Italy.
Starting off with Section 1. The 1967 Tactical Revolution. Lisbon Lions versus Catenaccio.
This right here was a literal clash of ideologies. On one side, you've got Inter Milan's supposedly unbreakable defensive science facing off against Celtic's chaotic, space-dominating, high-tempo revolution. Going into this match, Inter Milan were the reigning champions of a system known as Catenaccio, which translates to the door bolt. It was this ruthlessly defensive, highly intellectual system that the Italian media viewed as the absolute pinnacle of modern football. I mean, they literally called their players the magicians. But on the flip side, you had Jock Stein's Celtic, a team of local lads playing a radically different style. Stein instructed his fullbacks to push way high up the pitch as auxiliary wingers, his forwards were constantly rotating to destroy Inter's man-marking, and they deployed this relentless high press.
Okay, the crucial point here is this staggering number, 42. Celtic launched 42 shots at goal during the final. They turned the game into a relentless siege until Inter's organization finally just cracked, resulting in a 2-1 Celtic victory. To put that into perspective, 42 shots in your European final against the literal masters of defense is almost mathematically incomprehensible. Inter scored an early penalty and just sat back, fully expecting their system to absorb the pressure like it always did. But Celtic just kept coming. And it wasn't just mindless aggression. You know, it was a highly coordinated, tactical dismantling of Catenaccio that fundamentally changed how the game could be played forever.
Let's move on to Section 2, the denial of Lisbon, dismissing the revolution.
So you really have to wonder, why did the Italian press dismiss this totally historic victory as just luck? Instead of recognizing Jock Stein's brilliant tactical shift, the Italian press framed the result as a total aberration, a stolen game, a fluke. To the Italian media establishment, admitting that a team playing with overlapping fullbacks and sustained offensive pressure had exposed Catenaccio's deepest flaws was simply too much to bear. It would basically mean admitting that their entire footballing philosophy, which they viewed as this elite intellectual game of chess, was now obsolete.
Psychologists and analysts actually have a term for this. It's described as tactical blindness. It's essentially a psychological defense mechanism protecting the Italian sporting press from the incredibly uncomfortable realization that their beloved system had been fundamentally exposed. They simply couldn't compute that this fluid movement was actually a highly advanced, specialized counter system. And because they couldn't understand it, they just flat out rejected it.
To maintain their sense of intellectual superiority, the media spun a wild narrative of misfortune and brute athleticism. They completely ignored the coordinated positional play that unpicked Inter's man-marking. They literally blamed sfortuna, bad luck. They painted the Celtic players as these physically overpowering barbarians at the gate who just happened to bash the door down on one single afternoon. They even took that incredible statistic of 42 shots and flipped it on its head, arguing that Celtic were just incredibly wasteful, whereas Inter's minimal chances were the mark of clinical efficiency. Honestly, it was an absolute masterclass in denial.
All right, jumping to Section 3, Italy's toxic media culture, a systemic crisis. If we fast forward to today, analysts argue that the psychological rigidity has evolved into a highly toxic, hypercritical modern media ecosystem. The refusal to accept nuance or change hasn't gone away at all. It just metastasized in how all sports are covered in the country. Sources from the fixed media highlight several systemic drivers for this. They note that the quest for honest reporting has often been replaced by a chaotic, emotionally exaggerated conversation that's practically designed for clicks. Newsrooms are increasingly drained of resources, right? So you have established journalists, often without any specific expertise, parachuted in to cover major events. And their mandate is basically to produce controversial opinions that drive engagement. Add to that a hyper-competitive, turbo-capitalist perspective born in the 1990s, where second place is just the first loser, and you get a media machine that treats athletes not as human beings, but as mere tools for debate.
Just listen to this quote. It perfectly captures the extreme, almost militaristic rhetoric used by the media. Tennis player Jannik Sinner was harshly criticized as a traitor simply for withdrawing from the Olympics with tonsillitis. The media compared him to high jumper Gianmarco Tamberi, who competed after a renal colic. By framing athletes as warriors or soldiers, the media creates this awful trap. If you don't literally destroy your body for the result, you are painted as a coward. There is absolutely no room for empathy or basic human health.
Which brings us nicely to Section 4, Warriors, Traitors, and Sexism.
So when 19-year-old swimmer Benedetta Pilato expressed pure joy at a fourth-place Olympic finish, commentators reacted with total disbelief. It showcased a massively toxic demand for perfection and a severe generation gap. Pilato missed bronze by just 1/100th of a second, and she called it the best day of her life. But the old guard in the media couldn't fathom an athlete being happy without a medal around their neck. They actively shamed a teenager on national television for feeling joy about her own massive personal achievement.
Furthermore, critiques point out some seriously pervasive sexism. For example, an Olympic gold medal women's fencing team was described not by their athletic merits, but by their relationships and maternal status. Instead of using the athletes' actual names or celebrating their incredible sporting achievements, a major national newspaper reduced these champions to their proximity to celebrities, their nationality, or their role as a mom. It totally infantilizes and marginalizes women's sports in a way that critics argue is deeply, deeply entrenched in the culture. And look at this breakdown sourced from AC Milan bloggers. It highlights a profound disconnect between reality and media narratives. Critics argue this hypercriticism often disproportionately targets black players through an accepted form of mainstream racism. For instance, Rafael Leao was actually named UEFA Player of the Match, yet Italian papers called him the absolute worst player on the pitch. Goalkeeper Mike Maignan committed a standard foul, and a club president called his actions murderous, a framing that was quickly amplified by the press. And when Victor Osimhen was racially mocked by his own club's social media, the mainstream press largely spun a narrative supporting the club over the player. The disconnect from reality is just staggering.
Finally, let's bring it back to the pitch with Section 5, Modern Clashes, Celtic and Italy.
So how does a media landscape trapped in its own rigid expectations process the very team that shattered their illusions back in 1967? Well, in 2019, Celtic completely shattered their historical struggles in Italy. They utilized a flexible three-man defense to frustrate Lazio and secure a dramatic injury-time victory. This was a massive moment. After 3 draws and 9 defeats over the years, 13 failed attempts, Celtic finally won on Italian soil. What was really fascinating here was the tactical adaptation. They shifted to a system explicitly designed to thwart and frustrate the Italian side, ultimately beating them at their own game.
Tracing this timeline, we actually see Celtic's evolution. They went from the ultimate attacking disruptors in 1967 to executing highly disciplined, tactical masterclasses on Italian soil in recent years. By the time we hit 2024, Celtic goes up against Atalanta, the top scorers in Serie A, and Celtic approaches it completely differently than the 67 side. They just rip up their usual attacking rulebook and adopt a deeply pragmatic, fiercely defensive stance.
Now here is the ultimate irony. Following a 0-0 draw against Atalanta in 2024, the Italian press actually praised Celtic for employing the exact same defensive barricades that Inter Milan used back in the 60s. The media wasn't angry, they were genuinely impressed. They recognized the sheer discipline it took for Celtic to defend for long stretches with 11 players in the last 25 meters, totally stifling Atalanta's normally potent attack.
85. Think about that for a second. That gutsy 2024 performance, anchored by Kasper Schmeichel's 6 saves, remarkably ended a bruising run of 85 consecutive European matches where Celtic failed to keep a clean sheet. 85 matches without shutting out an opponent in Europe, and they finally do it in Bergamo against one of the most aggressive pressing teams in all of Italy.
And far from calling it luck this time around, the Italian media totally respected Celtic's practical approach. They hailed them as a Scottish rock. You had major papers talking about the bitter draw for Atalanta, and fully acknowledging that despite 90 minutes of an absolute siege, the Scottish champions had morphed into unbeatable defenders. The respect was earned through grit, which is a stark contrast to the absolute denial we saw back in 1967.
Which leaves us with this final, really provocative thought. After spending decades trapped in toxic denial about their own footballing philosophy, has the Italian media finally learned to respect the game, or just the ghosts of their own past? It's endlessly fascinating to see how a culture that once outright rejected Celtic's attacking brilliance as a fluke now wholeheartedly praises them for perfectly executing the defensive dark arts of 1960s Italy. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope this deep dive into sports, psychology, and media has given you a completely new perspective on the beautiful game. See you next time.